First of all, thank you for inviting me to this interesting conference. And I think to an extent I will prolong what was said by Mart before me, just complementing his presentation with some facts concerning the situation in translation. And as I am going to talk about deeds and omissions, to use the legal terminology in the field of literary translation in the Soviet period Lithuania, I am going to touch upon very briefly on literary translation as a tool of ideological manipulation, the reader-oriented approach in creating the Soviet canon of world literature, unacceptable or bad authors, the preventive censorship from late Stalinism to perestroika, just getting to some case studies, and in conclusion, give a few thoughts concerning the specific conditions of the Baltic republics. Oh, sorry. That's it. Okay. Now, when studying the relationship between ideology and translation, power relations come into fore. And many researchers like Gens, Levitt, Sherry, Rudnitska, many concluded that in the USSR, literary translation was a powerful tool of ideological manipulation. It acquired a special significance where the Soviet power realized what Susanna Witt described as the largest, more or less coherent project of translation the world has seen to date. But this project had its own rules of the game, and these practically were enforced through institutions of censorship. I'm not going to speak about that in more detail, but there's a lot on Glavlit and the relationship with all those repressive and controlling powers just influencing translation. But this institutional censorship covered all spheres of life. And of course, the most pressing control was exercised over cultural products, over language and literature. First of all, the original literature written in national languages, but accordingly into Western literature as well. Now, why was it like this? We understand through the documents referring to the situation of that time and the decrees that were issued, and find out that the goals of the Soviet censorship were to eliminate all texts that contradicted Soviet political ideology, to suppress the cultural influence from Western countries that was considered poisonous, to create ideologically biased Soviet canon of world literature. Well, we know that theory of social realism, that the world literature was to be shown as uniform, as reflecting the same socialist real categories as in the Soviet Union. Others were to be ignored. And finally, to educate the Soviet individual pursuant to the moral code of the builder of communism. The most important outcome was that translation was turned into part of the national politics and translators into workers of the ideological front, as they were called. Naturally, specific requirements were introduced to their work. Now, if we consider these goals of the Soviet censorship, we will see that they are all reader-oriented. According to Dobrenko, Soviet culture could be defined as a political and aesthetic project radically focused on the recipient. At the same time, the reader is not only the recipient of literary works, but the object of the entire process of societal transformation. As the reader is to be turned into that builder of communism, following the doctrines that the Soviet state tried to instill into any individual, starting from the kindergarten and, of course, all of the people following the same principles of, well, as I said, that of the communist builder. Now, a number of political documents that were issued to that effect, and publishers had to follow them in all republics. I'm not going to speak about those tenets of the socialist realism that were this Zhdanov's school of 1934 and so on. But for instance, in 1947, Vladimir Yermilov, senior editor of Literaturnaya Gazeta and one of the most influential literary proponents of socialist realism, published an article in which he declared that the main task of Soviet criticism was to evaluate literary works in terms of their usefulness for the cause of communist education, and it was obliged to show what a Soviet person should or should not be. So it relates to that idea that everybody has to be, that everything that is written is oriented towards the recipient of the text, because the goal is to transform the Soviet person into something that one should be like. Now, accordingly, publishing, let's say, of 10 good works does not completely neutralize the harm that one bad book can make, as said by Tchaikovsky. By bad books, Tchaikovsky means those not corresponding to задачам воспитания советских людей в духе преданности идеалам коммунизма и ненависти к буржуазному быту и идеологии. Well, the task of bringing up the Soviet people in the spirit of devotion to ideas of communism and hatred to the bourgeoisie way of life and ideology. Now, in order to protect the reader from those bad books, as he says, quite an intricate system of censorship was introduced. And as we are speaking about translation, I'll just say a few words about the type of censorship that was practiced in the field of translation. Well, actually, if you go to theories on censorship, there will be quite many different types. In translation, three main aspects are important, because translation had some specific features compared to original works. And first of all, censorship could be done before the publishing and after the publishing. That is preventive and repressive if something happens to be published and then they realize, oh no, it's not good for our Soviet people, so it has to be taken out from circulation and so on. And of course, self-censorship, that is the result that we acquire from this constant pressure and spread to your own life and your own personal situation. So this preventive censorship that actually I am dealing in this presentation has actually two forms. One is related to cultural blockage, as Valsts calls it. Simply, you ban the authors or books from appearing in the translation at all. If there is no author, there is no. I remember that when I grew at school, I didn't know Orwell existed. If something is banned, he or she's banned, and that's it. And another aspect of preventive censorship is that, let's say, well, the author becomes so famous and so well known in intellectual circles, so it's better to have it published, but with a little bit of cutting, of changing certain words in translation so on. So this is another aspect of preventive censorship. That is, unacceptable ideas are just deleted, but then the book may appear. Now, what are those unacceptable bad authors? There are hundreds of them. The Estonian research, well, not the Estonian, but the researcher working in Estonia, Nijole Maskaļūniene, calculated over 400 authors and titles that were forbidden in Estonia in the Soviet period. But if they were forbidden in Estonia, that means they were forbidden in Latvia, they were forbidden in Lithuania, all over the country. And one of our dissident writers who who emigrated to the United States, wrote an article in which he summarized which type of authors were forbidden. So first of all, dissidents, emigrants, opposition writers like Joseph Brodsky, Vladimir Nabokov, then authors of anti-communist works in the West, like Huxley, Kostler, or George Orwell, they did not exist at all. Western authors, socialists, who later changed their views. There were many of these among the French authors who visited the Soviet Union, then they were disappointed of what they saw, of what they read, and they changed their views. So since that moment, they became persona non grata, and their books were no longer published, like André Breton, André Gide, Dos Passos, Ignacio Silone. Now, writers who condemned certain aspects of Soviet politics, for example, on human rights, like Günter Grass or Arthur Miller. So again, they became persona non grata. Catholics or mystics in general, like Bernanos, Chesterton, or Paul Claudel, writers with a reputation of nihilists, reactionists, of supermodernists, and like Kafka's Bev or Virginia Woolf, writers having contact with extreme writers' movements, and writers actually engaged in the analysis of sexual aspects in human life, because certain topics did not exist in Soviet reality. So those were the not translated authors. Now, also, this other aspect of preventive censorship was practiced in their case. Some of them could have had, like Chesterton, some book published, but with certain cuts. And sometimes 1/3 of the book was cut out to reach the Soviet reader. But the majority of them were not supposed to enter the Soviet literary market at all. Now, I will give you now a few cases of what was published and what was translated. Of course, the situation changed through those 4 periods that most of the researchers divide the Soviet period into. Well, in the Baltic republics, it will be late Stalinism, Khrushchevian thaw, stagnation, and perestroika. Now, late Stalinism was the period when this censorship was the strictest, and the situation was of the Stalinist regime at the beginning of the occupation was most what word to use, the strictest, and of course in the atmosphere of fear, deportations, the guerrilla war going on in Lithuania until 1958. So under these conditions, the rules for publishing were especially stringent. So what did they publish? I only took 3 examples from the Spanish literature. Well, and you see the titles of Cervantes' Don Quixote. You see the anonymous picaresque novel Lazarillo de Tormes, and one of the books, The Guerrillas of Levante. Just nobody knows, I think, that book, because it was not very important in the literary history of Spain or anywhere else, but it was politically important in the former Soviet Union, so it was published in Lithuania as well. Now have a look at those titles, just covers of the books. Well, The Guerrillas of Levante, Levante being the area in Spain in which this guerrillas were functioning during the Francoist War. The author is inside the book. There is no indication of what book, of what language the book was translated, most probably from Russian. And it was translated by a communist leader, just to educate the Soviet persons. And I must confirm that hardly anybody read it, because when I ordered this book in the library, I was the first to cut the pages. So it means that since that time, nobody took it, because the pages were not cut. It was me who did it. And so it is clear why this book was published, because it coincided with the ideological agenda of that period. Now look at this Don Quixote. I copied this title because of one reason. You may not understand, but it's written that the translation was edited by Alexis Hurginas. Edited, not translated, because the translator was Pulgis Andriušis, who fled to the West in 1944. And as such, he could no longer exist in any literary publications. So all those writers and translators who left Lithuania after the war, they disappeared from the discourse at all. Therefore, it's only the editor that is marked. Now, finally, that third book, this picaresque novel, I could not find any evidence why it was translated, because it is it's treated like a book of entertainment, and also it's anonymous, and also it's from the same 17th century as Don Quixote, so it's far distant, it's pretty safe to publish, and also it is possible that it would be read by the people, bought by the population, because, you know, the book by Ilfan Petrov's The 12 Chairs and The Golden Calf, these picaresque novels were very popular in the Soviet Union, so to some extent, this one kind of continued that tradition. Now, speaking about other periods, like Khrushchevian Thaw, well, it was marked by, you know, by this a little bit more liberal situation. And first of all, there was a huge amount of Latin American authors translated, because many of them were considered friends of the USSR. They were invited to the Soviet Union. Some of them praised the Soviet Union, the achievements, the life. They got the Lenin prizes. I won't go into detail of those writers, but there was quite a big group of those Latin American friends. And then there was the boom of books published in this period. Of course, in Lithuania, the same as in other Baltic republics, from what I read, this period of Khrushchevian Thaw was marked by the expansion of translated literature. Now, I also marked two books by Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe, and Barry Advich's Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that you all know, that were translated in this period. But what do we get? What do we get? We get the books without religion. We get the books with all the places where God is mentioned, and everything that relates to the content of those books practically is distorted to an extent that the literary idea is absolutely non-existent. For instance, Robinson Crusoe was considered, it was written following the biblical mythic of this bloody sin. Yeah, just the son who has an argument with the father, leaves the home, and after all these adventures coming back, his father forgives him his sins. And all this turning of Friday into a Christian, all these passages where Robinson Crusoe teaches him how to be a good Christian, and all the teachings of the Bible, nothing is in that book. So actually our children who read this book have no idea of what the essence, or at least certain aspect of it are. Now, the same as Uncle Tom's Cabin, a huge part of the text was deleted. And what is disappointing that this text is circulating today. They do not, there isn't a single translation that tried to introduce the missing passages in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Robinson Crusoe was published in full, just some 20, maybe even years. At the beginning of independence, it was published in full because its translator had all those passages that were left out, and he included them all. But Uncle Tom's Cabin is still circulating without lots and lots of cuts out. Now, in the period of stagnation, I would like to mention Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. Hemingway was one of the most popular foreign writers in the USSR. Again, I'm afraid I don't remember the exact year, but when people were questioned about the most well-known writer from the West, so Hemingway was marked #1 all over the Soviet Union. And still, his book, For Whom the Bell Tolls, was not translated because of the criticism that it contained about the Soviet officials functioning in Spain during this Francoist regime and in that war. And even when it was finally translated with the text about the book and about the writer written by a famous Russian author, Konstantin Simonov, who was Герой Советского Союза and all that. So he wrote this article for the book to be inserted in the book. And even in that, he said that Hemingway was misled. He didn't understand that, and some ideas that he had are not realistic. They were misunderstood, and so on and so forth. And this book appeared only in 1968 in Russian and was translated into Lithuanian in 1972. What was happening with that book? First of all, there was a practice that if you were translating a foreign author, first of all, you had to check if it was translated in Russian. Only then it was allowed to translate it into other languages. That was kind of a rule. And then, what's even more important, you had to check what cuts were made in the Russian or in the Russian translation. So when following the Russian translation, there were over 20 cuts done in the Russian version of For Whom the Bell Tolls. So the editor marked all those places for the Lithuanian translator. The Lithuanian translator, Povilas Gasiulis, refused to make those changes. He refused to cut the book. What happened? He was dismissed from work. He no longer worked in Vilnius. He moved to a provincial town. He was sued. He was he suffered a lot, but all those, not all, but almost half of those cuts in Lithuania, there were, yes, were still done. And who did them? Somebody further. Now, it's a great pity that when you read about Hemingway's translation, it said, Gasiulis did this, Gasiulis did that, there are missing passages. The fact that he didn't cut them out, that he refused to cut them out, and that he suffered because of his refusal is never mentioned, because somebody above him did. And actually, it is kind of the fault of translators that something is missing. But this particular example shows that it was not the translator. It was at some other level. It might be the editor, it might be somebody else. And the editor was young, and she said, I showed to him what was discrepancies with the Russian text, but he refused to change them. Still, the book was published with all those cuts. Now, Kerouac and Cortázar were special cases because those were the books that were published in Lithuania before they were translated into Russian. And these were really an exceptional case. Now, I just took, for Perestroika, I only mentioned Vineta, the Karl May's book. It seems an adventure stories and so on. On the other hand, the main publishing house for fiction, Vaga, in Lithuania, refused to publish it. It was translated and published by another publishing house and was very, very popular. So even in the period of Perestroika, this ideological approach was observed very, very strictly. Now, to conclude, some specific conditions of the Baltic republics, the question is, when you look at the whole history of this 50 years period under Soviet occupation and translation, the question is whether Moscow tolerated a broader spectrum of foreign literature in the Baltic republics due to the specific conditions there, or on the contrary, was the freedom of choice even more restricted than in the metropolis or other more socialized republics? This question is constantly raised because we do not have a clear-cut answer. Some arguments say for the one, the other facts show for the other. Now, what do we have here? Let's say that some books, as I mentioned, were translated and published even before the translation into Russian. Some were accidental, others were maybe more politically directed, but the fact is that some of the translators were people who suffered imprisonment, that were exiled to Siberian camps, and some were even famous politicians and diplomats, and they were given translations. Like the first editor of this state publishing house, Valys Drasdauskas, was arrested in 1949 and only came back to Lithuania in 1956, and one of the things that was in his file was saying that he promoted too many Western authors, and for that he got 10 years. But later on, when he returned, he was always translating. He always got the translation. So in certain other republics, maybe it would have been impossible. Now, on the other hand, in the period of Khrushchevian thaw, very many books, especially in Estonia, were published that were on this list of the writers that should have been banned because the journal Looming started this series, and every year some 52 books were published of the authors like Italo Svevo or Kafka for the first time in the Soviet Union. And it was considered that maybe because Estonians had access to Finnish publishings and Lithuanians had access to Polish ones, lots of Lithuanians knew the Polish language. So maybe then they were more lenient to look at that. In other cases, and I am finishing, don't worry, just in other cases it was just the contrary. I want to quote one quotation where a Lithuanian politician says that when choosing books to translate, we need to keep in mind the conditions in our republic. For example, Heinrich Böll's book, Unsagte kein einziges Wort, was considered by the ministry, and it was concluded that it should not have been submitted to our republic. Just as sometimes the ministries do not allow some films to be shown in our republic, even though they are widely shown in the union screens. That means the rules are kind of considered more specific in the Baltic states, and certain books and certain films should not be showed here. The same happened with Remarque's Black Obelisk. Remarque was also a very popular writer like Hemingway in the Soviet Union, but the Black Obelisk was not allowed to be published in Lithuania, although it was already translated and sent for publication. And when the editor-in-chief asked, well, it's published in Uzbekistan, it's published somewhere else, why do you not allow it to be published in Lithuania? It says, well, in your republic, the conditions are different, and the sound of this book will be, the resonance of the book will be quite different. So these facts kind of show that the policy was even more stringent. Therefore, we are kind of in between. Something was more relaxed, something we got kind of more than was not possible in other republics, but in other cases we looked that we looked kind of the territory in which certain books or films would have a different resonance than in the rest of the Soviet Union. Thank you very much.